My name is Sofia Reyes, and I'm 35 years old. For 9 years, my family treated my career as an insurance fraud investigator like a strange, faintly embarrassing hobby that happened to come with a paycheck, especially compared to my brother-in-law Marcus, the family's celebrated real businessman, who built a growing furniture warehouse from a single storefront into a regional operation. At my niece's christening this past spring, in front of nearly 30 relatives, my own father told the table that my job was basically just reading spreadsheets and pretending to be a detective. 4 months later, a fire destroyed Marcus's warehouse 11 days before a balloon payment he had no way of making, and the resulting insurance claim landed, through nothing more than ordinary case assignment rotation, directly on my desk. Before I walk you through exactly what I found in that file, if you've ever had your work described as pretend by people who never once asked what it actually required of you, go ahead and hit subscribe, but only if this story genuinely resonates. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and it matters more than you'd think to know who's out there listening with me. Now let me take you back to where this all began, because you need to understand exactly how my family built its hierarchy of worth before you'll understand how completely that hierarchy came apart. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, the middle child of three, born to a father who spent 30 years managing inventory logistics for a regional grocery chain and a mother who worked part-time at a dental office for most of my childhood. My older sister, Camila, was the family's presumed success story from an early age. Outgoing, quick with people, the kind of person who could walk into any room and have 3 new friends within the hour. My younger brother, Danny, was the baby of the family, doted on in the specific way youngest children sometimes are. I was the middle one, quiet, methodical, the kid who alphabetized her bookshelf for fun and kept a running ledger of her allowance in a spiral notebook by age 9, not because anyone asked me to, but because something in me had always found genuine satisfaction in the specific patient work of making numbers tell an accurate story. I want to give you a small example from childhood because I think it explains a great deal about how my family came to view me. When I was 12, our elderly neighbor Mrs. Aldana was convinced someone had been stealing small amounts of cash from her purse during her weekly bridge games, and rather than accuse any of her friends outright, she asked me, half as a joke, to help her figure out what was happening, because she knew I liked puzzles. I spent 2 afternoons quietly cross-referencing which week's money had gone missing against who had attended each game, and identified correctly that it was in fact her own adult grandson, visiting on Tuesdays to check in on her, who'd been slipping bills from her purse while she made tea. My parents thought the whole episode was cute, a funny story to tell at dinner parties for a year or 2 afterward. Sophia solved the case of Mrs. Aldana's missing cash, they'd say, laughing, the way you describe a child's finger painting. Nobody, including me at the time, understood that this was actually the very first sign of exactly the career I'd eventually build. I studied accounting in college with a specific focus on forensic methods, drawn to the discipline the same way some people are drawn to solving crossword puzzles, not because I found numbers glamorous, but because I found genuine satisfaction in the patient, exacting work of figuring out what a set of records was actually telling you, as opposed to what someone wanted you to believe they said. I graduated, took an entry-level position at a regional insurance carrier's claims department, and within 3 years had moved into the company's Special Investigations Unit, the division responsible for identifying and building cases against fraudulent claims, arson-for-profit schemes, staged accidents, inflated property damage claims, the whole quiet, unglamorous universe of people trying to profit from an insurance policy dishonestly. It is exacting, demanding work that requires you to read financial records the way a forensic pathologist reads a body, understanding not just what's there but what's conspicuously, tellingly absent.
None of this ever registered with much weight in my family. At every gathering for the better part of a decade, my career got described at best as Sophia's insurance thing, and at worst as some version of basically doing paperwork, a phrase that always managed to land exactly the way it was meant to, small, dismissive, closing the conversation before it had really opened. My mother, to her credit, at least occasionally asked me follow-up questions, though usually more out of polite obligation than genuine curiosity. My father was less generous, and I want to be honest that I think some of his dismissiveness came from an old-fashioned, unexamined belief that real work involved building or selling something tangible, the kind of work he understood instinctively from 30 years managing warehouse inventory, and that anything involving spreadsheets and financial analysis was, in his mind, somehow adjacent to real work without quite qualifying as the genuine article. My sister Camila married Marcus Delgado 9 years ago, when I was 26 and just beginning to build real momentum in my SIU career. Marcus was, by every outward measure my family cared to notice, exactly the kind of son-in-law parents dream about: charismatic, hard-working on the surface, the kind of man who could walk you through his 5-year business plan with a confidence that made you want to invest in it yourself. He'd taken over a small, struggling furniture retail store from his own father and, over the better part of a decade, expanded it into Delgado Home Furnishings, a regional operation with a large retail showroom and, more significantly for this story, a substantial warehouse facility on the outskirts of Tucson that housed the bulk of his inventory. My father adored Marcus from the very first family dinner, and I want to give you a specific example of exactly how that adoration manifested itself over the years, because it matters for understanding everything that followed. At Camila's engagement party, my father stood and toasted Marcus as the kind of man who builds something real with his own 2 hands, a phrase he'd repeat, in one form or another, at nearly every family gathering for the following 9 years. Marcus's newest showroom expansion, Marcus's latest big client contract, Marcus's steady, visible growth as a genuine businessman. Meanwhile, over that same 9 years, my own career progressed from entry-level claims adjuster to senior SIU investigator handling 6-figure and occasionally 7-figure fraud cases, testifying as an expert witness in 3 separate criminal prosecutions, building a reputation within my company as one of the most meticulous investigators in the regional division. My father, as far as I could tell, never once asked me a single detailed question about any of it. Here's a moment that has stayed with me for years, because I think it captures the entire family dynamic in a single scene. At a 4th of July barbecue about 5 years ago, an old family friend asked me, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, what exactly my work involved day to day. Before I could answer properly, my father cut in, laughing warmly, and said, "Oh, Sophia basically reads through paperwork looking for typos, more or less. It's very detail-oriented." He said detail-oriented the way you describe a hobby involving crossword puzzles, a kind, dismissive phrase that closed the conversation before it had really begun. The family friend nodded, satisfied, and the conversation drifted, within about 90 seconds, back to Marcus's recent warehouse expansion. I didn't correct my father. By then, I'd learned that correcting him rarely changed anything except my own exhaustion by the end of the evening. Okay, let me pause here for a moment because I know some of you are already recognizing this particular flavor of dismissal, the detail-oriented, the basically just the careful, almost affectionate way certain families manage to shrink serious, demanding work down into something they don't have to take seriously. If you've ever had your profession described in a way that made it sound like a pastime rather than a discipline, drop a comment because I promise you, this room tonight is full of people who understand that particular exhaustion intimately. And stay with me, because I want to walk you through exactly how thorough and exacting my actual work had become over those 9 years, because the scale of what I'd built professionally is the only reason the ending of this story lands the way it does. By the 9-year mark of my career, I had built a reputation within my company's SIU division as an investigator specifically known for catching what other, less patient examiners missed: the small, seemingly innocent discrepancies in a financial record that, taken together, told a very different story than the one a claimant wanted an adjuster to believe. I had handled arson investigations involving struggling small business owners desperate enough to torch their own inventory rather than face bankruptcy, staged burglaries designed to claim insurance on merchandise that had actually been quietly sold off the books months earlier, and inflated damage claims following legitimate accidents, where a policyholder had simply decided an unfortunate event was an opportunity to pad their payout. I understood, with a clarity my family never once asked me to explain, exactly what financial desperation looks like on paper before it ever becomes a fire. Marcus's business, meanwhile, had been showing small, quiet signs of exactly that kind of desperation for roughly 18 months before the fire, signs that I, as it happened, was in a somewhat unusual position to notice, because my sister Camila had begun confiding in me, in the casual, half-worried way sisters sometimes do, about tensions at home over money that Marcus never discussed openly with the rest of the family. She mentioned, at one point about a year before the fire, that Marcus had taken out a substantial expansion loan 2 years earlier to open a second showroom location, a location that had underperformed badly against his own projections, and that he'd more recently taken a second loan, structured with a large balloon payment due at the 18-month mark, to cover the resulting cash flow gap. She mentioned it in passing, as a worry rather than a confession, with no idea that the specific structure she was describing, a struggling business, an underperforming expansion, a balloon payment looming with no clear source of funds to cover it, was, in the specific professional language of my field, a textbook precursor to exactly the kind of scheme I'd spent 9 years learning to recognize. I never once mentioned any of this at a family gathering, partly out of respect for Camila's confidence, and partly, I want to be honest, because some tired part of me had simply stopped expecting my family to engage seriously with anything I noticed professionally, even when it touched their own lives directly. I filed the information away, the way you file away a slightly unusual detail that hasn't yet become relevant to anything, and I went on attending family dinners where my father continued praising Marcus as the family's real businessman, the one who built something with his own 2 hands, while my own decade of exacting, high-stakes professional work continued to be described, at best, as detail-oriented paperwork. My niece's christening took place this past spring at a large family gathering that included nearly 30 relatives, held at a restaurant Marcus had generously, and, I would later understand, somewhat desperately, insisted on covering the cost for in its entirety. It was during the toasts, after Marcus himself had spoken warmly about fatherhood and family, that my own father stood, glass in hand, and delivered a longer speech than he'd perhaps originally intended, one that started as pride in Marcus and, as these things in my family so often did, ended as an unflattering comparison to me. Marcus has built something real here, my father said, his voice carrying easily through the private dining room. A business, a livelihood, something you can actually see and touch and be proud of. That's the kind of ambition I always hoped to see more of in this family. He paused, and I watched, with the same tired recognition I'd felt at that 4th of July barbecue years earlier, several relatives' eyes flick briefly toward me before returning to their plates. Some of us, he continued, gesturing vaguely in my direction with what he clearly intended as an affectionate joke rather than a genuine cruelty, went into fields that are a little more abstract, I suppose. Sophia's job is basically just reading spreadsheets and pretending to be a detective, from what I understand. It's not like she actually catches anything real day to day. He laughed, lightly, and a handful of relatives offered the same small, uncomfortable chuckle I'd heard at that barbecue, and the conversation moved on within 30 seconds, back to Marcus's plans for a 3rd showroom location he'd apparently been discussing with several relatives that same afternoon. I sat there, glass in hand, and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, something closer to a tired, familiar recognition of a pattern I'd been living inside for the better part of 2 decades, now spoken aloud in its plainest possible form, in front of an audience of 30. I didn't say anything at the christening. I want to be honest that this has simply never been my instinct. My entire profession is built around patient, methodical analysis conducted well after the initial moment has passed, not reactive statements made in the heat of a live confrontation. I finished my meal, congratulated Camila and Marcus warmly on their daughter, and drove home that evening thinking, not for the first time, about exactly how little my family understood about what 9 years of careful, demanding work had actually built. Okay, let me pause here for a second, because I know some of you are wondering how I managed to sit through that entire toast without saying a single word. If you've ever absorbed something painful in a room full of people because you knew instinctively the moment wasn't the right one to fight it, drop a comment, because I promise you, that particular restraint deserves more credit than it usually gets. And stay with me, because 4 months after that christening, my actual profession, the one my father had just called pretend, in front of 30 people, was about to become the single most consequential thing in my entire family's world, whether any of them were ready for it or not. The fire at Delgado Home Furnishings warehouse occurred on a Tuesday night in late September, roughly 4 months after the christening, destroying the facility and an estimated $800,000 in inventory according to the initial claim Marcus's company filed with its commercial property insurer. I want to be clear that I had absolutely no role in the assignment of that claim to my desk, SIU cases are distributed through an automated rotation system based on claim value, geographic region, and current investigator caseload, entirely independent of any personal relationship an investigator might have to a given policyholder. It was, genuinely, nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence of timing and case volume that the file landed with me rather than one of my 6 colleagues in the regional office. I didn't recognize the business name immediately when I opened the initial file. Delgado Home Furnishings was the store's registered corporate name, distinct enough from Marcus's own name that the connection didn't register until I pulled the ownership records 2 days into the preliminary review, at which point I sat at my desk for a long moment, feeling the specific, uncomfortable weight of recognizing exactly whose claim I was now professionally obligated to investigate with full rigor. I called my supervisor immediately, exactly as ethical practice and company policy require the moment any personal relationship to a claimant becomes apparent. I need to disclose that the policyholder on file 4471, Delgado Home Furnishings, is owned by my brother-in-law, Marcus Delgado. I told her. I have no financial interest in the business and no role in the fire itself, but given the family relationship, I want you to have the option of reassigning the file to a different investigator if there's any concern about how it might look. My supervisor, a careful, no-nonsense woman named Diane Whitfield who had trained me personally during my first 2 years in the department, took a full day to consider it before calling me back. Your track record is exactly why I'd rather keep you on this one, Sophia, with full disclosure in the file, she told me. I've watched you handle sensitive cases with more integrity than half this department combined. Proceed, and we'll document the relationship formally in the case file from the outset, exactly as required, so there's no question later about transparency. I want to pause here for a moment because I think this is worth sitting with honestly. I could have pushed harder for reassignment, spared myself and my family whatever was coming. I thought about it seriously, actually. Turning the decision over for the better part of an evening the way you turn over a set of financial records you weren't sure you'd read correctly the first time. What I ultimately decided was this. Reassignment wouldn't change whatever the investigation actually found. It would only change whether I was the one to find it, carrying my own full disclosure and integrity behind the finding, or whether it fell to a different investigator who had no personal stake in getting it exactly right and might, depending on their own diligence, miss something I would have caught. I decided, finally, that I trusted my own rigor more than I trusted the comfort of stepping away, and I proceeded with the investigation exactly as I would have for any other policyholder. Here's what the investigation found. Over the following 6 weeks of careful, methodical work, the same 6 weeks that included an uncomfortable number of family dinners where nobody yet knew what case had landed on my desk, the fire marshal's initial report had already flagged the point of origin as consistent with an electrical fault near the warehouse's rear loading dock, a conclusion that, on its face, supported an accidental cause. My own review of Delgado Home Furnishings' financial records, however, records I obtained through standard SIU subpoena authority as part of any significant claim investigation, told a considerably more complicated story. The company's expansion loan for the second showroom, exactly as Camila had mentioned to me in passing over a year earlier, had underperformed badly against Marcus's own projections. The subsequent bridge loan carried a balloon payment of just over $400,000, due exactly 11 days after the date of the fire, a payment Marcus's own bank records showed he had no realistic ability to make. I found, further, that Marcus had, roughly 3 weeks before the fire, quietly transferred a significant portion of the warehouse's actual physical inventory, verified through supplier delivery and sales records, to a storage facility under a different corporate name, while continuing to list that same inventory as present and destroyed on the insurance claim filed after the fire. In plain terms, he had moved a substantial amount of merchandise out before the fire, sold some of it separately, and then claimed it as destroyed inventory to inflate an insurance payout large enough to cover the balloon payment he otherwise had no way of meeting. I brought my findings to the fire marshal's office as part of standard SIU protocol for any claims showing indicators of potential arson for profit, and a joint investigation, conducted independently by both the fire marshal's arson unit and my own company's SIU division, ultimately determined that the electrical fault the marshal had initially flagged showed physical characteristics, a specific unusual burn pattern near the junction box, later confirmed through detailed forensic analysis, consistent with deliberate tampering rather than accidental failure. Combined with the financial evidence I documented, the joint investigation built a case strong enough that the district attorney's office ultimately filed formal charges against Marcus for insurance fraud and arson, roughly 2 months after the fire itself. I want to walk you through the family conversation where all of this became known, because it's the moment in this story that most resembles the confrontation you might expect, even though, like most real reckonings, it unfolded with less drama and more genuine devastation than a movie scene ever quite captures. Camila called me the evening the charges were formally filed, her voice unlike anything I'd ever heard from her before, shaking, disbelieving, moving between anger and grief in the space of a single sentence. "The investigator's report has your name on it," she said. "Sophia, did you do this? Did you go looking for a way to hurt him?" I want to be honest with you that this question landed harder than almost anything my father had ever said at a dinner table because it came from my own sister at the exact moment she needed, more than anything, someone steady to help her understand what had actually happened. "Camila, I didn't go looking for anything," I told her, keeping my voice as calm and steady as I could manage. The claim landed on my desk through ordinary case rotation, before I even recognized the company name. I disclosed the relationship the moment I found it, and my supervisor made the call to keep me on the case because of my track record, not because I asked to be. I didn't set that fire, and I didn't move that inventory to a storage unit under a different name 3 weeks before it happened. Marcus did that. I just did my job, the same job Dad spent 9 years calling pretend, and it happened, this time, to find something real. There was a long silence on the line. "I don't know how to hold both things at once," Camila said finally, her voice breaking. "That you're my sister, and that you're the reason he's facing criminal charges. You don't have to hold both things the same way," I told her, as gently as I could. "I love you and I love my niece, and none of that has changed. But I'm not the reason he's facing charges, Camila. The fire is the reason. The inventory he quietly moved out beforehand is the reason. I just happened to be the one whose job it was to notice what was actually there in the records, instead of what he wanted the claim to say." Okay, let me pause the story here for a moment, because I know some of you are wondering how a family survives a moment like this one. A sister investigating, however unintentionally, the husband of another sister, in a case that ends in real criminal charges. I want to be honest that surviving it hasn't looked like a clean, tidy reconciliation, and I think it's important to be truthful about that rather than pretend this story wraps up in a neat bow. If you've ever had to hold on to your own integrity even when it meant genuine, lasting strain with someone you love, drop a comment, because I think that particular kind of grief deserves to be spoken about honestly. My father's reaction, when the full story came out, was the one that surprised me most, and I want to walk you through it carefully, because it wasn't the reaction I expected from a man who had spent 9 years praising Marcus as the family's real businessman. He called me about a week after the charges were filed, and his voice, when I picked up, carried none of its usual easy confidence. "I've been reading through the news coverage," he said, referring to a regional business journal article covering the case, one that named me directly as the SIU investigator whose findings had triggered the joint arson investigation. "They're saying your analysis is what actually built the case, Sophia. The financial records, the inventory transfers, all of it." He paused for a long moment. "I called you basically just paperwork at Sophia, at the christening. I don't think I ever really understood what your work involved until I read what you actually found." "You had 9 years to ask," I told him, not unkindly but honestly. "I've handled cases like this for most of my career, Dad. I've testified as an expert witness in criminal trials. This wasn't new work for me, it was just the first time it happened to touch someone close enough that you couldn't dismiss it as abstract anymore." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and it was, I think, the most direct apology I'd ever heard from him in 35 years of being his daughter. Not just for the toast at the christening, for all the years before it. "I don't think I ever actually looked closely enough at what you built to see that it mattered." I want to be honest that this conversation with my father didn't fully resolve things overnight, and I don't want to pretend it did just to give the story a tidier ending than it actually had. Marcus's case moved through the legal system over the following year, ultimately resulting in a plea agreement that included restitution to the insurance company and a suspended sentence with probation, given his lack of any prior criminal record and the cooperation he ultimately offered once the evidence became overwhelming. Camila and Marcus separated during that year, a separation that had as much to do with the financial devastation and broken trust the case exposed as with the charges themselves, and Camila has, slowly, over the following months, rebuilt a version of her life that no longer depends on Marcus's carefully maintained image of success. Let me take you forward about 8 months, because I think it's important you understand this wasn't a single dramatic phone call followed by instant, complete healing. About 4 months after the charges were filed, my father mentioned, at an otherwise ordinary Sunday dinner, that he'd been telling a coworker about the meticulous work Sophia does catching insurance fraud, a phrase so different from, basically, just paperwork that I actually asked him to repeat it, genuinely uncertain I'd heard correctly. About 8 months after the charges, at a smaller family gathering, my father raised a toast, a real one, aimed squarely at me, thanking me for the kind of careful, honest work most people never have to demonstrate the courage to do, especially when it costs something personally. It wasn't a grand, cinematic reconciliation. It was a toast at an ordinary family dinner, offered honestly by a man who had finally, after 9 years, actually looked closely enough to see what had been there all along. A full year after the fire, my company promoted me to senior investigator overseeing the regional SIU division's most complex commercial fraud cases, a promotion built directly on the reputation my handling of the Delgado case, among others, had cemented within the company. Camila, rebuilding her own life with my niece, has told me more than once, in the months since, that she's grateful, in the end, that it was me who found what needed finding, rather than someone with less care for how the truth would land on the people it touched. You were gentle with it, even when you didn't have to be, she told me recently. I don't think I understood before all this how much skill that actually takes. Here's what I want you to take from this story, if you've stayed with me through the whole thing tonight. Careful, unglamorous work is still real work, and its value is never dependent on whether anyone found it exciting enough to respect at a dinner table. Loving your family doesn't mean looking away from an uncomfortable truth, especially when looking away would only protect someone's dishonesty rather than their actual well-being. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for the people around a hard truth is to handle it with the same care and integrity you'd bring to any other case, rather than letting it destroy you along with everything else. And the people who mock what you do, calling it pretend or basic or abstract, usually understand it far less than they think they do, which means they're rarely in any position to predict exactly what your quiet, patient expertise is actually capable of finding when it finally matters. If this story meant something to you tonight, if you've ever had your careful work dismissed by people who never once asked what it actually required of you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe, hit that notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves tonight, and keep doing the patient, exacting work, even when nobody at the table has bothered to ask what it costs you to do it well.